Philip II of Spain, born in 1527, ascended to the throne as one of the most powerful monarchs in European history. His reign from 1556 until his death in 1598 marked a period of intense religious fervor, military conflict, and political ambition. Under Philip II, Spain became the dominant global power, holding vast territories in Europe, the Americas, and Asia. Known as the Most Catholic King, his reign was defined by his commitment to maintaining Catholicism in an increasingly Protestant world. Philip's early life was shaped by the legacy of his father, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who left him a vast empire upon his abdication. With territories stretching from the Netherlands to the New World, Philip inherited an empire whose wealth was bolstered by the treasures of the Americas. Yet, despite his immense power, Philip's reign would be marred by a series of personal and political challenges that would ultimately define his rule. A deeply religious man, Philip's devotion to Catholicism guided his decisions. His first major act upon becoming king was to wage war against the Protestant Reformation that had gained momentum in Northern Europe. He sought to maintain Catholic unity and prevent the spread of Protestantism, particularly in the Netherlands, where Protestant resistance to Spanish rule was growing. This religious zeal led to the Dutch revolt and the brutal suppression of Protestant rebels. The atrocities committed during this period, most notably the Spanish Fury in 1576, would cast a long shadow over Philip's reign. His policies, though intended to preserve the Catholic faith, fueled a growing resentment against Spanish rule. Philip's foreign policy was equally ambitious, including his ill-fated attempt to invade England. In 1588, he launched the Spanish Armada, a massive naval invasion intended to overthrow Queen Elizabeth I and restore Catholicism to England. The Armada was decisively defeated by the English fleet, led by Sir Francis Drake, and the failure marked the beginning of the decline of Philip's dominance on the world stage. Despite these military setbacks, Philip continued to rule with an iron fist, relying heavily on his advisors and the influence of the Catholic Church. His relationship with his subjects and his family, however, became increasingly strained. His relentless pursuit of religious conformity alienated many, and his rule, though strong, grew increasingly unpopular both in Spain and across Europe. Philip's personal life was as tumultuous as his political reign. His marriage to Mary I of England was part of his broader strategy to unite Catholic Europe, but it was also a deeply emotional union for Philip, who yearned for a partner who shared his religious devotion. The death of Mary in 1558 left Philip bereft, and he never remarried, becoming increasingly isolated and absorbed in his work as king. His emotional detachment from those around him, including his children, would have a lasting effect on his mental and physical health. By the time Philip reached his later years, his reign was plagued by personal sorrow, military defeats, and the growing realization that his efforts to maintain a Catholic empire were faltering. Despite the wealth of his empire, Spain was becoming financially strained due to the ongoing wars, and Philip's relentless pursuit of Catholic dominance had led to deep political divisions within his territories. It was during these final years that the true nature of Philip's suffering began to manifest. His guilt, caused by the failures of his reign, began to weigh heavily on him. Though he was outwardly pious, Philip's personal life and rule were marked by self-inflicted pain. His health deteriorated, and the once mighty king, who had ruled over a vast empire, became consumed by his own regrets and fears. As Philip II entered the later years of his life, his empire, once a symbol of immense power and grandeur, began to unravel. The internal strain of maintaining a vast empire, compounded by the failures of his foreign policy and the financial strain of continuous wars, left Philip mentally and physically exhausted. Yet, It was not only the political challenges he faced that wore him down, it was the deep, unrelenting guilt that tormented him. Philip was a man driven by religious duty and a sense of divine mission. His father, Charles V, had been a ruler of extraordinary ambition, but Philip took his father's devotion to God and Catholicism to an extreme. His father's empire had been built on conquest and diplomacy, but Philip's was sustained by an obsessive desire to uphold the Catholic faith at all costs. It was this obsession that would be the root of much of his sorrow. In his later years, Philip began to believe that his personal failures, his inability to secure the Protestant Reformation and the loss of his treasured possessions, were a direct consequence of his sin. He saw the fall of the Spanish Armada and his inability to contain Protestant uprisings as divine punishments. Philip began to pray fervently for forgiveness, seeking penance for what he believed was his inability to carry out God's will. His intense guilt for the wars he had waged, particularly the ruthless suppression of Protestants in the Netherlands and the slaughter of the Dutch, began to take a toll on his mental state. But it wasn't just political failures that haunted him. Philip's personal life was marked by deep anguish. His first wife, Mary I of England, died young, and their hopes for a Catholic heir were dashed. Though he had remarried, his second wife, Elizabeth of Valois, died shortly after giving him a daughter. His third marriage to Anna of Austria was a bitter disappointment, as it too failed to produce the son Philip so desperately needed to secure the future of his empire. The absence of a male heir left Philip anxious about the future of Spain and his legacy. His son, Don Carlos, whom Philip had raised to inherit the throne, became mentally unstable, and their relationship grew strained. When Don Carlos died under mysterious circumstances in 1568, many believed it was the result of political maneuvering, but for Philip, it was yet another failure that deepened his guilt and sorrow. The thought of his own son's tragic demise weighed heavily on him, and Philip became consumed with guilt over his inability to protect him. It was in the last decade of his life that Philip's physical health began to deteriorate drastically. His body, once strong and imposing, was ravaged by illness, and he became increasingly withdrawn. His once sharp mind, now clouded with guilt and regret, no longer held the clarity it once did. He spent much of his final years in isolation, consumed by his own fears and religious devotions, praying for redemption even as his empire crumbled. Philip's belief in divine punishment grew so intense that, according to historical accounts, he would sometimes pray for pain. The physical suffering he endured seemed to have become a form of penance for the sins he believed he had committed. He would spend long hours in prayer, fasting, and begging for mercy, believing that only through his suffering could Spain be saved. His fear of dying with his sins unatoned haunted him, and he was said to have even wished for greater physical pain to atone for his perceived transgressions. Yet, despite his fervent prayers, the inevitable was drawing nearer. The kingdom he had worked tirelessly to maintain was disintegrating. The Spanish Armada had been defeated, the Netherlands was in revolt, and Spain's wealth from the Americas was rapidly being depleted by endless wars and political mismanagement. His attempt to impose Catholicism on Europe had met with resistance from Protestant nations, and many began to see Spain not as the beacon of Christendom that Philip had hoped to create, but as a tyrannical and isolated empire. In the final years of his life, Philip II's empire was fractured. His children's futures were uncertain, and his kingdom was in turmoil. His health continued to decline, and by the time of his death in 1598, Philip was a shadow of the monarch he had once been. He died at the age of 71, a broken man whose dreams had been shattered by his own guilt. His death, however, was not an act of God. Despite his belief in divine punishment, it was the result of years of personal and political struggles that had eaten away at his soul. When Philip died, Spain entered a period of slow decline. The empire he had worked so hard to build and protect began to wither, and his son, Philip III, inherited a weakened kingdom. Though Philip II was mourned as a king who had been devoted to his faith, his reign had ultimately been marked by a series of failures that would lead to Spain's eventual fall from the heights it had once known. Philip II's life and death are a testament to the dangers of excessive ambition and unchecked guilt. His reign serves as a cautionary tale about the destructive power of a monarch's inner turmoil. The legacy of Spain's greatest king was not one of glory, but one of suffering, a suffering that began in his soul and ultimately led to his death. A death that was not ordained by God, but was the result of his own guilt and inability to reconcile his failures.